Hello, everybody. We're going to begin today discussing some poetic terms that we will use when we read and analyze poetry. We are building some tools in our toolbox for reading and analyzing poetry. And over the course of the next week or so, we're going to learn, I guess about 20 different terms. And I do want you to take note of these. There will be a quiz on them at the end. And we'll be using them a lot as we read and analyze poetry throughout the course. So the first two terms that I'm going to begin with are speaker and tone, and they both have to do with what's called the voice of a poem. And I'll begin with speaker. What is it we mean when we say the speaker of a poem? Now, students sometimes when they're talking or writing about a poem will say something like this: the this poem feels. And I want to suggest that this is a subtle but important error to be fixed. And to make that claim, I want to show you first this poem by the Victorian British poet Robert Browning called My Last Duchess.
That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now. Frau Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Will it please you sit and look at her? I said Frau Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance. But to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I, and seemed as they would ask me, if they durst, how such a glance came there. So not the first are you to turn and ask thus. Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess' cheek. Perhaps Frau Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much. Or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half-flush that dies along her throat. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whate'er she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Sir, 'twas all one. My favour at her breast, the dropping of the daylight in the west, the bough of cherries some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mule she rode with round the terrace, all and each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush at least. She thanked men, good, but thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900-years-old name with anybody's gift. Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling? Even had you skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such an one, and say, just this or that in you disgusts me. Here you miss, or there exceed the mark. And if she let herself be lessoned so, nor plainly set her wits to yours, forsooth, and made excuse, e'en then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whene'er I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile? This grew. I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. There she stands, as if alive. Will please you rise? We'll meet the company below then. I repeat, the Count your master's known munificence is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed. Though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed at starting, is my object. Nay, we'll go together down, sir. Notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity which Claus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me.
All right, so what's going on in this poem? That's My Last Duchess upon the wall, as if she were still alive. Well, as you read on or listen on, it sure sounds like the speaker of the poem is really dissatisfied with his wife. And why he's dissatisfied, well, that might be hard to pick up the first time through, but if you read closely, the lines that you see here in blue, he is bothered that she smiles at things. Go, let's see if this helps. He's bothered that everything makes her happy. Now, why would that bother him? All of these things, my favor at her, he says, sir, 'twas all one. My favor at her breast, that is the gift he gave her to wear, or the dropping of daylight in the west, or the cherries that someone brought her, or the white mule she rode around the terrace on, all and each would draw from her the approving speech, or blush at least. So she was thankful. Yes, that's good, but she thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900 years old name with anybody's gift. This man is intensely jealous. He's jealous that his wife, his last Duchess, could be pleased by something other than himself. Now, the title of the poem is My Last Duchess. Why is she his last Duchess? What happened to this woman? Well, down here, the lines I've highlighted for you in red is the hint that we get from the speaker of the poem about what happened. I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. He had his wife killed. He had his wife killed because of his arrogant and petty jealousy that he didn't want her to smile at anything else, and he would not stoop, in his mind, to explaining to her, honey, it really bothers me when other things except me make you happy. I choose never to stoop, he says. Well, this is a horrible man, a toxic relationship, and he had her killed. And this is a poem written by Robert Browning. And if you know anything about Robert Browning, you might remember that Robert and Elizabeth Barrett Browning were one of those like really sweet love stories from British literature. By all accounts, the two loved each other very much and wrote poems with each other in mind. In fact, we'll look at one of hers here in a minute. So what's going on here? Well, of course, this is a narrative poem. It's telling a story, and when we read it, we don't, of course, assume that Robert Browning is confessing to killing his wife. Nor do we assume that Robert Browning, secretly harbored the desire to do it, right? Because he's able to write a poem and he's able to create a narrative voice for the poem that can communicate an experience to the reader, even if it's an experience that he himself has never gone through or considered, except in the act of dramatically making it, right? So that's why we have the term speaker. We have the term speaker to put some distance between any claim about what the author of the poem may or may not have felt or done and what the narrative voice of the poem is talking about. So, a definition for speaker is the voice used by an author to speak or narrate a poem. And it's important to say the speaker is often a created or selected identity and should not automatically be equated with the author. And I might even go so far as to question this word often. Maybe in some sense, the speaker is always a created or selected identity. Well, what do I mean by that? Here's a very famous love poem from Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the wife of Robert Browning, that even if you've not read the whole poem before, you might have heard these opening lines. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach, when feeling out of sight for the ends of being an ideal grace. And it's a really sweet love poem. It's a great love poem. Well, now, I don't doubt that Elizabeth Barrett Browning, in her personal life, in fact, felt a deep love for her husband that she was able to express in this poem. But nevertheless, if I'm writing about this poem, I wouldn't write about Elizabeth Barrett Browning feels, or Elizabeth Barrett Browning says, or the author communicates. I'd still talk about the speaker. Well, why? For two reasons. One, anytime a poet creates something, even if it does come from their own personal experience, it's a kind of selected or edited identity of themselves, if that makes sense, right? They're drawing on certain experiences that they've had or emotions that they've felt, and they're giving life and breath into those as a poem, right? But those were like carefully selected from a wide range of experiences that a woman might have with a husband, right? So it's not like Elizabeth Barrett Browning is putting her whole self on display. So, in one sense, I say I'd still insist on using the speaker here because the I of this poem, while I'm sure Elizabeth Barrett Browning felt it, one, that is a biographical claim rather than a poetic one. That is, to back that statement up, I would need evidence from Browning's life and not evidence from the poem. And two, even though I'm sure she felt it, it's a kind of carefully selected or edited identity. And there's also this, that whenever a poet puts something down on paper, the poem takes on a life of its own. The poem itself becomes a thing, and now speaks not just for Elizabeth Barrett Browning's own love or relationships, but for any lovers who looks at this poem and feels that it expresses for them too a love that they couldn't put into words before, right? So that's what I mean when I say, in one sense, it's a selected identity of Barrett Browning, and in another sense, she's kind of opened it up to anybody. So, for those reasons, it's better, instead of starting your essay or your statement with the author of the poem feels, let's just say the speaker of this poem feels. That's the claim that can be evidenced from the poem. All right, our second literary term today is tone. And tone is a word that we get from listening to each other speak. We know perfectly well what we mean when we say, don't use that tone with me, or her tone of voice bothered me, or I didn't like his tone, right? And we hear when we use the word that way, what we mean is behind what the person is saying, there's a way that they are saying it that we can pick up on, right? And in conversation, this is effortless, usually, for most of us. We don't have to put a whole lot of thought into, hey, wait a minute, what is this person's tone? Now, in text, like if you're text messaging somebody else, well, now that is a problem, right? You can't always be sure what their tone is. That is the attitude in which they said the thing when they sent that text, right? And that's how we're using the word in poetic analysis. Tone is the narrator's or speaker's attitude toward the reader or the people, places, and events in a work, as implied by the elements of the author's style. Now, why do I add this last phrase and highlight it? As implied by the elements of an author's style. We're not just making blind guesses at the attitude of someone else who has sent us a text, as it were, like the poem is a text that we've been sent. It's not just, I think this person was happy or angry or whatever. You are looking for evidence in the poem that suggests what the attitude is, right? So that's what I mean by this phrase, as implied by the elements of the author's style. Tone is described in adjectives, and I don't have my notes in front of me, so I'm sorry, I forget where I grabbed this quotation from. Tone is described in adjectives that express emotion or manner. So, in other words, any adjective that could describe an emotion that a human being might feel or a manner in which they might say something, we can use that word to talk about the tone of a poem, right? There are tons of examples, and I have just thrown a few up here on the screen, and I also gave you a handout with, I don't know, 60, 70 of them or so. Right? There's a great game that is kind of an older one, but I used to play it as a teenager. It was a lot of fun. It's called Moods. And in this game, you have, as you can see, 10 different moods, and you draw them from a deck of cards, so they're all random, right? And then you have another box of cards that has different phrases that you're supposed to say. And they're just like silly off the wall or sometimes very commonplace sort of phrases like the lawnmower is out of gas or something like that, right? And then you roll a 10-sided die and you secretly look at it and you're going to get one of these moods that you are supposed to recite that phrase in, right? So if I roll and I look in the cup there and I see that I have a 3. Oh, I'm supposed to say this in a way that all the other players can tell I'm ashamed, right? And so I can communicate. That's what we're talking about here. That's tone. Now, in an acting game like this, you communicate that with body language. You communicate that with your voice. The lawnmower is out of gas. Okay, I tried to sound ashamed right there. But as an author of a poem, in order for the speaker of the poem to sound ashamed, how am I going to pull that off as a poet? Well, the word choices that I use, the comparisons that I make with figures of speech like metaphors and similes. So those are the sorts of things that you will be looking for when you try to ascertain the tone of a particular poem. So how do you determine the tone of a poem? Look at the poem's word choices, its images, the mental pictures that it creates, the figures of speech, the comparisons that it uses, sometimes even sound devices. Like if the poem sounds real bouncy or something, then that is evidence that it's not going to be an especially grim tone unless there's some kind of irony at work there, right? So it's complicated. There are a lot of things that are at play, but we're trying to become skilled at determining a speaker's tone in a poem, just as we are naturally skilled in determining a person's tone when they're speaking to us. All right, so finally, I want to have a look at figures of speech, because those are going to be important in the poem I'm asking you to read tonight. Now, a figure of speech is kind of a category word for any use of language that deviates from the literal meaning. Any use of language that deviates from the literal meaning. So that's why I say it's a category term, and it includes lots of different things, and we'll go over 4 right now. Here are 4 common figures of speech that you should know, and probably at least 3 of them you already do, and metonymy maybe, right? So it's a figure of speech because, remember, I'm deviating, I'm turning aside from the literal meaning of the words, right? I have a second meaning that I'm trying to communicate in addition to the literal meaning. And when we look at some examples, I hope to make that clear for you, right? So the 4 common figures of speech I'd like us to know are metaphor and simile. You should know those well. Personification is giving human attributes to non-human things. And here's the one that might be, I think we've learned it in the past, I think, but it might be unfamiliar to you. Metonymy is the use of a closely related idea or object to stand in for another idea. So let's look at some examples. Oh, sorry. First, before we do that, I'm going to dig a little deeper here in order to examine what makes a figure of speech work. A figure of speech is operating on 2 levels, a literal and non-literal level. And so in a figure of speech, you have what's called the tenor, which is the subject that you are actually talking about, the non-literal thing you're trying to illuminate with this comparison. And you have the vehicle. And the vehicle is the literal thing in your words, which you're actually using not to talk about that thing itself, but to shed some light on the tenor. Well, what does that mean? So you might have heard the line from Shakespeare, all the world is a stage. All the world is a stage. Now that's a metaphor because it's a figure of speech. It's not literal. The speaker is not saying that the world is literally like these, boards that you walk around on and so on, right? Rather, the speaker is trying to shed some light on the nature of the world, the tenor, the subject being illuminated, by comparing it to a stage. When Jacques first says this in the play, the hope is that readers will think, or listeners will think, the audience will think, boy, now how is the world like a stage? And there, in that moment, is what a metaphor is for, to get the audience, the reader, the hearer, to think, well, now how is this thing like that thing, right? Another very common metaphor or simile you might have heard is, my love is like a red, red rose. My love is the tenor. It's the subject being illuminated, the thing actually being talked about. And in order to shed light on, to talk about the speaker's love, it is compared to a red, red rose. All right, here's another one. I think this comes from a poem by Gwendolyn Brooks, and its title, the line is, "Love is the wild card of existence." Now, this, unlike these other 2, by the way, is a fresh metaphor for you. A fresh metaphor means you probably haven't heard it before, whereas one that you've heard time and time again, it doesn't even work as a metaphor anymore. That is, when you hear my love is like a red, red rose, you probably don't pause and think, how is love like a rose? But when you hear one you've not heard before, love is the wild card of existence. Now that is kind of arresting, kind of startling, gets you thinking, right? Well, what's the tenor and what's the vehicle here? What we're actually talking about, the tenor, the subject we're seeking to illuminate, is love. And how we're doing it is we're comparing it to a wild card. Love lets you draw 4. Here's a very famous poem by the 20th century African American poet Langston Hughes. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Now, there are 2 similes in this snippet of the poem here. Both of them reflecting back on this tenor, a dream deferred. Deferred means put off for another day. Langston Hughes is talking about the demand of Black Americans for equal rights and being told to just wait, hold that thought, put that off for another day. Just be patient, you'll get it eventually. So he writes this poem, what happens if you keep deferring a dream? And he gives us 2 similes, 2 comparisons, which are meant to illuminate that. Does that dream dry up like a raisin in the sun? Now that's a simile, of course, not a metaphor, because the word like makes it an explicit comparison. Or does a dream deferred fester like a sore and then run? Okay, here's a great example of metonymy. The pen is mightier than the sword. Now in metonymy, the tenor is left unstated, and the vehicle just sheds light on the tenor by close association, right? So what I mean by that is pen is closely associated with the power of writing, and sword is closely associated with the power of military force. So when someone says the pen is mightier than the sword, they do not actually mean that a bic versus a claymore is a good matchup, but they mean the power that can be found in writing about events ends up being greater than the power to be found in conquest. As always, it's not enough to just identify figures of speech. It's not just like a hunt and find game. Your task is to hypothesize about why the author makes that comparison, how the comparison expands or illuminates the thing being compared, and how the meaning of the poem as a whole is affected by the comparison. All right, we'll save that example for another day. See you guys later.